Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Conventional Wisdom Podcast, part of the Freedomcast Network. I'm your host, Samuel Vernon. Guys, I am super excited about this episode. I have got a lot packed into this one, so let's not waste any time and let's jump right into it. This is episode 2 of my Bitcoin series. Now, if you remember, my last episode was an introductory to Bitcoin, going over the basics of what it is and its broader implications. This episode is dedicated to everyone who still has some hesitations about Bitcoin. There's all kinds of rumors, myths, claims, fears, and just overall skepticism surrounding Bitcoin that need to be addressed. And it's worth going through and explaining each of them bit by bit so we can gain a better understanding of what Bitcoin is and what it is not. And in my next episode, we are going to do a comparison between life under a Bitcoin standard and life with our current economic model. So you're definitely going to have to join me for that one. But before I get into debunking some of these myths, I thought it would be a good idea to lay the groundwork and give a little bit of context to what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to read to you some Bitcoin obituaries. These are instances where someone either writes an article or gives an interview where they point out what's fundamentally wrong with Bitcoin and why it is ultimately doomed to fail. I think it's important to present some of these arguments up front to show you what is often said and often repeated about Bitcoin, because you probably have heard many of these arguments and possibly even hold a few of them yourselves, and if so, all the better. This episode is dedicated directly to you. I will address each of these points presented here, and probably a few others as well, to show you that Bitcoin is not what you thought it was, to show you that despite what everybody says about Bitcoin on TV, there is a reason why it has still survived all these years. There is a reason why it has appreciated 27,000%. There is a reason why it has done all of this without the help of any marketing team, despite all the negative press that it receives. So let me just read you a couple of these and then we will jump into the episode. Just for context here, Bitcoin is currently trading around $27,000. I want you to keep that in mind because you are going to hear people declare Bitcoin a failure when it was trading for a couple $100, even up to a couple thousand. And they will assure you that it is going to die any second now, even though it has gone on to make all-time highs. Just keep that in mind as we go through these. In 2015, near the bottom of the first bear market, or at least one of the first, if not the first bear market, when Bitcoin had crashed from $1,000 to about $200, the International Business Times in UK wrote a piece highlighting author and financial commentator Jeffrey Robinson, where he says, quote, "The whole thing is a pump and dump. There is no reason for Bitcoin to be worth $215 or $1,000, none whatsoever. It's not a currency now, it's a pretend currency. It doesn't even qualify or satisfy the requirements for a modern currency. The problem with disruptive technologies is that the disrupted has something to say about it. If the government wanted to kill Bitcoin, it would take them 2 minutes. That's all." All right, so what he's claiming here is the tried and true. It's a scam, but primarily governments will kill it if they wanted to, right? So we'll definitely get into those here in just a second. In the same year, 2015, when Bitcoin was a measly $236, the Washington Post wrote an article called "Bitcoin Isn't the Future of Money. It's either a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme." The very next line reads, "Whatever it is, though, it isn't a currency. It's a tech stock." So again, it's a common theme. Bitcoin is obviously a stupid scam. You should stay away from it. But here they actually point out that it's more or less a stock, which is very interesting, and we'll talk about that. Again, here's one in 2019 when Bitcoin was $4,900. Gizmodo published a piece that titled, "Bitcoin Surges 15% Overnight Because Nobody Learned Their Lesson After the Last Crash." The author wrote, quote, "To be clear, Bitcoin is absolutely worthless by any real measure. It's fake money that's about as practical to use in the real world as monopoly bills. Bitcoin is backed by nothing and requires tremendous amounts of energy to mine using computers. As it becomes more difficult to mine, it saps more and more energy, causing millions of tons of carbon dioxide to be pumped into the atmosphere and accelerating climate change. Bitcoin is little more than a speculator's death cult at this point." So the idea that Bitcoin is bad for the environment, remember this one because I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn about Bitcoin's energy use. Okay, moving on. Let's do a couple more. Even here in 2023, you have the Express UK who writes, quote, Bitcoin and all the pathetic fake currencies that popped up in its wake are the worst thing to happen to the investment world in my lifetime. They are a joke wrapped in a fraud, wrapped in a Ponzi scheme, and sold as a get-rich-quick investment. At its peak in November 2021, so-called altcoins had a total market capitalization of an incredible $3 trillion. All that for a digital currency that isn't backed by any central bank, has zero security, and can vanish in a second with no redress. Okay, here we see the claim again. It's a scam, but we get a new one. It's not backed by anything. This is obviously a pretty popular one. We'll definitely get into that one. Finally, Nassim Taleb, mathematical statistician, risk analyst, and author, this year tweeted, "What will eventually kill Bitcoin won't be a crash, but an inexorable decay. Fads are more threatened by indifference rather than disgust." Now, I want to be clear when I'm reading some of these, because I'm not necessarily saying that all of these people are wrong, simply because they are, for the most part, making claims about future events. And even though Bitcoin, it's done the exact opposite of what they said that it would do, or at least what they would lead you to believe, you can't actually disprove a nebulous future prediction, okay? So I'm not claiming that they're all just dead wrong. Only time will tell. I'm also not pointing the finger and laughing at any of them and saying, haha, what a bunch of idiots, because I think everybody, including myself, we all go through this period where we'll just believe anything at all about Bitcoin, and you can rationalize with yourself why exactly you're right and everyone else is wrong. But the main focus here is to point the finger at Bitcoin and show that despite what you think about it or have heard about it, it's still standing and stronger than ever. And so maybe, just maybe, we are thinking about this thing all wrong, and we need to correct some of our priors, let's say. So I want to go through each of these myths and a couple more and just hit on some of the highlights, some of the main ones that you're going to hear out in the wild, and explain what's wrong with them and hopefully convince you that, hey, this thing has been around for at least, 14 years, but still, it's got a bright future. It's being adopted, and I suggest you get a little bit just in case this thing catches on and continues to trend in the direction that it has been trending. So number one, volatility. We are going to talk about the idea that Bitcoin is too volatile to become a currency. Now, for the sake of argument, I am going to ignore the fact that really what's being said here is that it's volatile when priced in US dollars. And I'm going to explain later why that comparison is really not such a good one. But for now, I will take this argument at face value. You will often hear people complain about its volatility, and my response has simply been yes. Emerging markets are always volatile at the beginning. Bitcoin is still a baby. When lots of people are buying and selling it very, very quickly, you are bound to get large swings in price action. But the important thing to remember here is that it won't always be like this. As time goes on and Bitcoin's market cap grows relative to others, it's going to have less volatility when money is entering or leaving the market. But I want to take some time and talk about this because I think the whole volatility thing is just a knee-jerk sort of emotional response that people have. It really needs to be thought through. I'm going to ask you to zoom out for a bit. This is going to be a common approach to many of these myths about Bitcoin. In order to understand what's really going on here, we've got to zoom out. Too many people are looking at Bitcoin through a keyhole. They're missing the bigger picture. I know volatility can be annoying sometimes, but how should the price be acting? How should the markets be reacting? If you want them to be stable, be careful that you're not arguing stability for stability's sake. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that when looking at the price of goods, whether they're priced in Bitcoin or dollars or gold, those prices had better reflect market conditions. Otherwise, you simply don't have a free market. If the furniture factory burns down, you would definitely expect the price of couches to go up. And so over the long term, how do you want those prices to behave? Do you want them to go up, down, flatten sideways? I think most people would prefer if the price of goods trended downwards, which if you ignore the short term is exactly what you are seeing in Bitcoin. Bitcoin's value is trending up and to the right if you zoom out, which makes the relative price of everything else trend down. This makes Bitcoin very attractive for people wishing to hold their wealth long term. Many people are storing their value into Bitcoin and simply ignoring this short-term volatility because they know if they hold their Bitcoin long enough, they will see their purchasing power grow. As a crazy example of this, in 2015, the average price of a newly built home was $360,000, and the price of a Bitcoin was somewhere around $360. This means that if you were to buy the house using Bitcoin in 2015, it would have cost you 1,000 Bitcoin. But let's just say you decided to hold off on that and pause and wait 7 years. So fast forward until 2022, last year, the average price of a new home had jumped up to $540,000, but the Bitcoin price had leaped from that $360 to now $16,000. So if you were waiting from 2015 to 2022 to buy a house, you would only have to pay 34 Bitcoin in 2022 to get that house. Going from 1,000 Bitcoin to 34 is a 97% discount. Let that sink in. If you had waited the 7 years to buy, if you had saved your money for 7 years and held on to your Bitcoin, you would have had a 97% discount on a brand new home. With the remaining Bitcoin that you have, you could have bought 29 newly built homes. What's even crazier about this is that if you had held your dollars and saved in US dollars, you couldn't even afford the new home just 7 years down the road. The price would have shot up from $360,000 to $540,000. That's the power of Bitcoin's saving mechanism, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned that in my first episode. It is very attractive for people wanting to hold on to some value over time and actually gain value. Which brings me nicely along to another myth that needs debunking, this idea that too many people are just going to hold their money long-term in Bitcoin and the economy is going to dry up. So number 2, no one will spend their Bitcoin. I heard one person make this argument during some type of maybe quasi-debate on Bitcoin's functionality as money, maybe on a podcast somewhere. And the observation that he made was something like, there are people in Bitcoin known as hodlers. HODL is HODL, stands for hold on for dear life. These are people who are known as hodlers who simply will not sell their Bitcoin for anything. No matter how much you offer them, they are going to hold on to their Bitcoin. And of course, if this is extrapolated out to the whole population, then you have an economy who's trying to survive on all this money that's locked up in everybody's wallets. Obviously, this is unobtainable, and our economy would not survive this. Now, on its face, this view does seem to be correct, but for the fact that this person is making a number of false assumptions that need to be clarified. First of all, those of us who understand what Bitcoin is know that it's only a matter of time before it overtakes the US dollar. And we are trying to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible in preparation for this global adoption. So instead of selling our Bitcoin now for cash or some other trinket, we are saving our Bitcoin for a time in the future where it's going to be much more valuable, and we can buy that same trinket for much less Bitcoin. Hopefully maybe a 97% discount, just like that house. So putting aside that fact that we are in an adoption phase where people have a stronger than usual incentive to save their money, at the very least understand that in dollars or Bitcoin or gold, no matter what, people are always going to spend their money on their immediate needs. If everyone is on a Bitcoin standard, of course, people are going to spend their Bitcoin on the stuff that is necessary now, stuff like food and shelter. Now, after that, with whatever's left over, you can either spend your money on your future, say in the form of savings, or you can spend it on things that you don't really need, but you kind of want, like luxury goods. Businesses that sell those fancy goods and boutique items, they might not get the business from someone who is focused on saving their money today, but they will certainly get the business from and be marketed to the people who saved their money 5 years ago. There's always going to be a market for luxury goods. So I just don't buy this idea that having a good savings mechanism built into the currency like Bitcoin will cause the economy to lose steam and come to a standstill. I believe that it will lead to a prioritization of different markets, sure. And by the way, I don't see that as such a bad thing. But it won't be an abolition of them entirely. Also, as a quick aside, because I know this always gets brought up, many people are concerned that no one accepts Bitcoin, right? So you can't actually go out to your local grocery store and pay with anything in Bitcoin. Again, keep in mind, Bitcoin is still a baby, and we're definitely going to get there. We haven't gotten there yet, but we'll get there. But also, there are companies like Bitrefill or the Bitcoin Company that actually allow you to spend your Bitcoin, to pay Bitcoin buying gift cards that are accepted at all these major retailers. So effectively, it is allowing you to spend your Bitcoin and buy the groceries or buy the Amazon, whatever you need. So people do, in fact, spend their Bitcoin, and this idea that the economy is going to somehow dry up and die because Bitcoin is good at holding its value long term, it's just simply false. I mean, spending is going to occur just as spending is today, which brings up my next point of scalability, right? It's the notion that Bitcoin's transactional speed is just much too slow to handle global transactions. So number 3, Bitcoin cannot scale. This might have been a valid concern several years ago, but right now there's something called the Lightning Network. And if somebody is still complaining about scalability, then all they have to do is just look this up and see what it is. It's a protocol that allows payments to occur through channels that are not on the Bitcoin blockchain. So payments can be made between two people without the transaction ever needing to be verified by the miners, taking up much less space on the blockchain. Therefore, millions of them happening every second, costing maybe a fractions of a penny. It's incredibly cheap and incredibly scalable. And I don't really want to go too deep into the details of exactly how Lightning works because a discussion about this is just simply beyond the scope of this episode, but you're welcome to check it out for yourself. The point here and now is that Bitcoin absolutely does scale. The protocol has been in development since, I think, 2015, and infrastructure has been steadily growing alongside of Lightning, and it's been implemented and integrated into several companies, and even countries like El Salvador have invested millions of dollars into working and integrating the Lightning Network so that they can process transactions faster to meet demand to aid in Bitcoin's adoption. Which brings me along to number 4. Bitcoin will simply never be adopted. It is never going to achieve the global reserve currency. Now, I think a useful analogy here is to compare Bitcoin to the internet, because they are both giant leaps forward in technology whose benefits greatly outweigh any of the downsides. And even if there was a downside, you've got developers, entrepreneurs who are going to go out there and solve these problems because it's absolutely worth it. Everyone's lives are being improved by having these things around, okay? Almost everyone you meet is using the internet in some capacity to enrich their lives. And they really don't even think twice about it because it's worth it. It's worth having this thing around. No one is shunning the internet because really you do that and you ignore all of the upsides of what the internet brings. I believe this is going to be the exact same case for Bitcoin. It's just the advantage and ease of using Bitcoin is going to become so apparent that it's just going to be too attractive to ignore. Okay, Bitcoin is to money as the internet is to information. And if you think about that, in the past, most of the world's information was only stored in a few places. Like you got libraries, archives, universities, stuff like that. And you needed to shell out quite a bit of money and resources in order to have access to that information. But now you can pretty much find whatever you would like on the internet with just a few clicks. And now think about how we have handled money. Okay, in the past, it's always been subjected to, say, banking laws, inflation, or government seizure. But now you have Bitcoin. You have this permissionless money. It's available to everyone, and it can never be manipulated. So just as the internet freed information, Bitcoin has liberated the control of money from the few and distributed it to the masses. There really exists no other technology that has given financial freedom back to so many people as Bitcoin has. So of course, it's going to be adopted, and it already is. The largest asset management company in the world, BlackRock, has filed for a Bitcoin ETF. It's essentially a Bitcoin stock that is correlated to its price so that they can store up some of their wealth into Bitcoin. What's even more ridiculous is that there is a document from BlackRock, it's actually from an analyst at BlackRock, that has concluded that, and now remember, I mean, we're talking BlackRock here. They don't get things wrong very often. They've got the resources and the wealth to pretty much never miss the mark. Okay, so there's an analyst who concluded that the optimal allocation of Bitcoin that one should have in their portfolio is, what do you think? Like 2%, 10%, 25? No, this guy says 90% of your portfolio should be in Bitcoin. Okay, he did the math, he crunched the numbers, and he concluded you should put 90% of your wealth into Bitcoin. Okay, this thing is being adopted far faster than you realize. El Salvador has made it legal tender. More and more countries are increasing their mining capabilities in order to get as much of this thing as possible. You may not like it, and you may have your head in the sand. You may want to just ignore this thing, but Bitcoin is being adopted. You may think it's not. You may think it's some small part of the internet that's only for geeks and nerds, but it is being widely adopted all over the world. You don't see the effects of it so much in the most developed countries because in these developed countries, there's not much of a need for that. But as the dollar weakens, as the need for Bitcoin rises, which it will, you will see this thing being adopted. But of course, you are going to see a lot of people push back on Bitcoin, which brings me to my next point, number 5, that governments will simply kill it. Now, I cannot go through every single method that one might try to take down Bitcoin, but I can broadly talk about the main methods and why they are destined to fail against Bitcoin's incentives. And essentially, I can only think of 3 attack vectors. You've got the physical attacks, network attacks, and regulatory attacks. Now, up front, we can pretty much rule out any physical attacks. Bitcoin is far too decentralized for any government to go knocking door to door, confiscating any device with the Bitcoin code on it. That's simply just not an option. That leaves network attacks and regulatory attacks. But before going too deep into this, I think it's very important to point out that Bitcoin has been up and running for 14 years straight without any hiccups. It hasn't missed a single beat or a single line of code. It's just been tick-tock, next block. The code predictably functions. You got miners who's adding blocks every 10 minutes. Nodes are auditing the system. Transactions are going through. It simply works. Every day that Bitcoin is alive, it becomes more decentralized, and the amount of energy required to take it out simply just gets stronger. Okay, Bitcoin's most vulnerable time to be attacked has already come and gone. All right, so just keep that into perspective as we go through this. So, if the government or some malicious actor is going to attack the network somehow, a popular attack that I hear people talking about is the 51% attack on the miners. We're going to talk about that, but also they may do some sort of hack somehow. We'll talk about how they could possibly hack this system. A 51% attack is the idea that the government accrues the majority of the hashing power and then proceeds to mine empty blocks. It would be effectively slowing down the network to a standstill, and some believe that this is enough to end Bitcoin. But the reality is, not only is this something very difficult to coordinate without everyone just simply catching on early and thwarting them, but it's an extremely costly endeavor that will likely go bankrupt long before anything hurtful could possibly happen. And the reason for this is because they would have to continuously spend that 51% hashing power from here to eternity. And I don't believe anybody can do this. It's just simply far too much energy and resources. And it's also worth mentioning here that even with the majority of the hashing power, if the government could somehow capture that majority, they still couldn't steal any of your Bitcoin. They couldn't create new Bitcoin. They couldn't change any of the code or perform any double spends. They would simply just slow down the network for a short period of time. So attacking the network through the miners really isn't feasible. It's not going to get you anywhere. But what about attacking the nodes? Again, Bitcoin is so decentralized, this is really not an option. If you wanted to attack the nodes via some sort of network attack, it would require convincing everyone who operates a node, the hundreds of thousands of them around the world, to simultaneously change their protocols so that it would benefit you and not them. That doesn't make sense. It's simply not feasible. No one is going to agree to that. That leaves attacking the wallets themselves, where you store your Bitcoin. This would obviously induce plenty of fear and uncertainty in the system. And really, if your money can be easily stolen, then what's really the point of keeping and maintaining this Bitcoin system? And if I'm being fair and honest, people actually have lost their coins as a direct result of some type of hacking. But each time, inevitably, It was because they left their Bitcoin in the hands of some other third party. Mainly, it's one of those exchanges. This really should not be a knock on Bitcoin any more than, say, having your car stolen because you left the keys in the car and the door open would be a knock on the car manufacturer. Bitcoin was meant for you to be more responsible with your money. That means you need to own it. Don't leave it on some sort of exchange. Don't leave it at a bank. Don't lend it out to your buddy. It is your money. Put it in your wallet where you hold the private keys and keep your keys safe. Not your keys, not your coins. And if you want to go back to my first Bitcoin episode, I cover exactly what it would take for a hacker to actually get into your wallet and steal your Bitcoin. I'm telling you now, it's just not possible. So, all that to say, that really leaves governments with a regulatory attack on Bitcoin. So this is the one that everybody worries about, and I'll admit I probably worried about it too when I first got into this. But if you know a little bit about Bitcoin and just the incentive structures for everybody, a lot of this sort of melts away, okay? Fortunately for us, the government is horribly incompetent when it comes to getting anything done through the law, okay? It's usually slow and clunky, and there's plenty of loopholes. So it's kind of like you can think of it like the war on drugs as an example. The government's banned drugs because they didn't like them, but drugs are still around. They didn't die off. Did the government succeed in stopping drugs by simply declaring them illegal? So even with the threat of prison, they couldn't eliminate drugs. So if you thought that declaring war on drugs was going pretty well, try declaring war on something that's invisible, it teleports, and it makes people richer. But aside from their incompetence, let's just say for the sake of argument that a country does implement a ban. So even if every single person obeyed that law within their borders, then there's going to be people outside the country that are just going to keep on going as if nothing happened. They're going to keep using Bitcoin, and the code is going to keep on running. So at best case scenario, you set back Bitcoin's adoption by a few years in your own country. But the reality is that only hurts your country economically. We see this in China. China banned Bitcoin mining within the borders. Okay, all the miners just simply left to other countries, and they started making money for those other countries. China reversed that ban and wanted those miners to come back because they realized they're losing out on all this revenue. And not only are you going to lose out on economic growth by banning Bitcoin, but you are going to send a signal out to everyone. It's like an advertisement to use Bitcoin. It's a Super Bowl commercial for why you need Bitcoin if you decide to ban it. Argentina did this, okay? When they accepted a bailout from the IMF after the Argentinian central banks went broke, one of the conditions was that they had to agree to a Bitcoin ban. But what happened? They experienced triple-digit inflation for the last year or so, and the front-runner for presidency there is a very pro-Bitcoiner. And I think he's likely to win because maybe a ban of money is a gigantic indicator that we need a money that cannot be banned. I think the Argentinians are getting it. I think the rest of the world is getting it. I think a lot of people all over the world are waking up to the fact that when you ban Bitcoin, when you try and attack the network somehow, when you say that, hey, this permissionless money is no good, we don't want it, we want control of the money, it is a huge indicator, it is a huge advertisement to use that money, to adopt it even further and faster. I just don't see a winning strategy here where on one side you have the threat of force and a coercion to use a currency that is manipulated from the government. And on the other side, you have this permissionless freedom money that cannot be controlled, it cannot be debased, and it's available to everybody. Look, I have no doubt that if the US focused all of its attention and all of its energy on stopping Bitcoin, it could definitely do some damage. But realistically, I don't see any way that it could possibly outright kill the network. Because if we are looking at each player's possible moves on the chessboard, I just don't see how governments or any other bad faith actors can outplay Bitcoin and the Bitcoin incentives. Bitcoin adoption is on its way, and trying to stop it will ultimately fail. And number six is a very pervasive one. I have so much to say about this one. It's the idea that Bitcoin is somehow bad for the environment. I see article after article coming out saying that Bitcoin uses more energy than Denmark and its carbon emissions are contributing to climate change. Okay, so There is so much falsities wrapped up in all of this, but let's just start from that claim about the carbon emissions, all right? Bitcoin emits zero CO2. That claim is just flat out wrong. Miners are just overpowered computers whose byproduct is hot air. That's what they are. They're just powerful computers, and they emit hot air, not CO2. Not a molecule of CO2 is emitted from Bitcoin mining. Now, it's true, Bitcoin does use a lot of energy, but you know what? So does nearly everything else that we use in our modern way of life. Transportation, communication, education, all of these systems require vast amounts of energy. And if your gauge for whether or not something is right for society is its amount of energy usage, then I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you should probably go back to living in huts and eating berries and bugs and flowers, because then you'll be morally superior by not using any of Mother Nature's precious energy. It should go without me having to say this, but our modern way of life is owed to energy and its usage. So the question is not if Bitcoin uses a bunch of energy. The right question is, what energy is it using? And the knee-jerk reaction from everyone who is opposed to Bitcoin is to assume that it's using up all the energy that would have otherwise gone to some sort of noble cause, like a hospital or a school or something like that. Now, this is completely absurd. Bitcoin miners don't want the energy that's in high demand, competing for the energy that everybody wants, the energy for the hospitals and the other infrastructures. That would be entirely too costly for Bitcoin. Instead, miners, they chase the cheapest energy that they can get their hands on. And it turns out some of the cheapest energy there is stranded energy. This would be something like isolated natural gas pockets or hydroelectric dams somewhere way up north, far away from people. Right, so somewhere where the cost of transporting that energy back to society is far too large. Okay, it's just stranded somewhere where we can't get to it. Bitcoin miners will happily swoop into that location and transform that previously unused energy directly into money through Bitcoin mining using only an internet connection. You don't need gas pipelines, you don't need cables running across the country. All you need is an energy source and an internet connection. And then you can turn unused energy into wealth, into money via Bitcoin mining. And if you think about that, there has never been such an economic opportunity in all of technological history, where you can go wherever the cheap and abundant and natural energy is and convert that directly into wealth. People just have blinders on when they're thinking about Bitcoin because they're going to use anything to justify not liking it, including this FUD about Bitcoin's energy use. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you're going to find there is so much more. Like the fact that not only can Bitcoin capture stranded energy, but that they make existing energy systems more efficient. So imagine, if you will, you're an energy producing company and you provide electricity to a city, for example, okay? And on a good day, you produce more energy than that city demands, okay? That would be a pretty normal day because you don't want them to run out of energy, so you produce more. But sometimes that demand is going to drop, and now you've got energy that you're already producing that's going to waste, okay? Bitcoin miners can take that wasted energy and convert that into money. And this is exactly what you see in Texas. Bitcoin miners are hooked up directly to the electrical grid and operate when that energy demand is low, and then they shut down when that demand goes up because they, of course, it's too expensive when the demand goes up, but they're going to take whatever energy is very, very cheap for them to produce money off of that. And that money just goes back into circulation in whatever economy they are working off of. Okay, my whole point here is that Bitcoin miners are simply making existing energy systems or stranded energy systems more efficient or more profitable by capturing that wasted energy. So this whole demonization of Bitcoin because of its energy use is absolute nonsense. Bitcoin is a blessing to energy networks. And if we want to push this thing even more, Bitcoin's incentives drive economic growth by paying people to find the cheapest forms of energy out there. Now think about this for a second. Okay, think about the consequences. If you were a Bitcoin miner and looking for the cheapest places to mine your Bitcoin, where would you look? Well, in general, the poorer and less developed the country, the cheaper the energy, the cheaper it's going to be to mine Bitcoin. Now, I'm not being mean here. This is simply reality. And it makes sense because national wealth is closely correlated to energy use, right? So the less energy that a country uses, the less developed it is. So now you have an incentive to go to these places and generate wealth through mining, literally raising the economic status of poorer countries from the bottom up. I don't understand how people can say that Bitcoin is a bad use of energy. When you have zero emissions, more efficient energy systems, and wealth redistribution around the world, people should be praising Bitcoin's energy use, not condemning it. It's remarkable how far off the mark Bitcoin skeptics are when talking about its energy use. They're not just a little wrong, they've got it absolute backwards. Yes, Bitcoin uses energy, but so does airplanes. So does our modern way of life. The question is not whether Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. The question is what energy does it use and should it be using it? And it turns out Bitcoin uses the energy that no one wants. It seeks the cheapest energy and brings with it economic growth. And the more the miners use this energy, the more it secures the network and the more it secures the use of this incorruptible money. We want Bitcoin to use energy because it's worth it. I don't know of something worth spending our energy on more than a monetary base that will be used to determine what everything else is worth. Bitcoin uses energy because we need it to. Number 7, nothing is backing Bitcoin. You hear this one quite a lot, right? So it's not backed by any central bank or anything. I want to cover this one pretty quickly because in reality, everything that I just talked about, how Bitcoin is so closely tied to energy, it just means that energy is the thing that's backing Bitcoin. But I understand some people, they don't like this and they don't accept this idea because it's too esoteric, right? That you can't touch it, you can't feel it. So I'm going to offer a slightly different angle on this whole backing hurdle, okay? Saying that Bitcoin isn't backed by anything misses the whole picture. You need to zoom out and start thinking through why a currency is backed by something else. Okay, somewhere along the lines, we got it in our heads that the strength of a currency depends on its backing by something, namely gold. That's what everybody thinks about. It's the US dollar being backed by gold. The idea that something is backing the US dollar means that the dollar serves as more or less a receipt or a note of ownership for the thing that's backing it, the gold that's backing it. The only reason why we would need this two-currency system is because one excels where the other one underperforms. Gold's clunky and it's difficult to move around, so we needed the paper money. Paper money is really easy to print, so we needed the gold. And I'm going to talk a lot about this sort of dynamic in my next episode. Stay tuned. The problem with thinking that Bitcoin needs backing from something else implies that Bitcoin itself cannot do the job of the thing that is backing it. Bitcoin needs no such backing. It is far easier than gold to carry around and to transact with, and far more difficult to reproduce than paper money. So, of course, Bitcoin doesn't need backing. Your priors are inaccurate if you believe that. In reality, if you really want to get crazy with it, Bitcoin doesn't need backing because it's going to be the thing that backs everything else. But that's a non sequitur. That's a little bit too in the clouds. For now, let's not get crazy with it. I just wanted to address this notion that Bitcoin needs backing from something else. But while we're on it, while we're talking about backing from gold, let's talk about gold. Number 8, gold is better. You definitely hear this one a lot. There's always a comparison between Bitcoin and gold, and people just tend to gravitate towards gold for lots of reasons. Let's get into it. But before talking about gold itself, I need to quickly summarize a very well-known book amongst Bitcoiners called The Bitcoin Standard, and it's written by Saifedean Ammous. You probably won't find a single person who is sold on the idea of Bitcoin who hasn't heard of this book and who hasn't wholeheartedly adopted his thesis. In the book, he argues that the thing that becomes money is the one that is the hardest to produce. Okay, we don't use seashells or glass beads anymore for money because as soon as technology advanced far enough, or we encounter another civilization with an abundant access to that thing, the glass beads or the whatever, it's possible then to rapidly reproduce this currency ad infinitum, which will inflate its value down to zero. Everyone who keeps their money in a currency that is easily reproduced will see their wealth fade over time, and by contrast, anyone who places their bets on the currency that is the harder one to create will see an increase in wealth due to the absorption of the weaker currency. So in this case, hard and easy refer to the ease with which the currency is duplicated. Hard currencies will always beat out easier currencies. The underlying idea here, and I think I might have said this in my last episode, is that if a currency can be made easily, it will be reproduced readily. Okay? The hardest currencies will eventually become king, and that's why gold has remained king throughout history and civilization. It's due to the difficulty with which it is reproduced, along with other great properties that we're definitely going to talk about here in just a second. And by the way, I will discuss why the dollar has supplanted gold as the global reserve currency in my next episode because there is a valid reason for it. Okay, the general rule, however, still remains about hard currencies beating out easy currencies. So this is an important concept to understand because if you're going to be hung up on gold and constantly make the comparison between gold and Bitcoin, then you're going to eventually need to wrestle with the question of why gold? Why has gold survived the ages as a money and not something else? And of course, Saifedean would argue it's because it is the hardest currency to create, but inevitably, many people are going to immediately draw upon a comparison between the two, between Bitcoin and gold, and point out that, well, at least with gold, I can touch it, and then there is something physically there. Gold it's shiny and it's beautiful, and it will always be valuable because people wear it as jewelry, and it even gets used in some industrial applications. Okay. Again, I'm going to have to ask you to zoom out a bit and look at the function of money itself and the problem that Bitcoin is trying to solve. Gold is valuable in part because of those reasons, because you can touch it and it's shiny and it's pretty. But that is not the source of its value. Those things help. Yes, beautiful and useful things tend to be more valuable than ugly and unuseful things. But if you can imagine that gold was some ugly, dull, puke green color and completely useless for any sort of real-world industrial application, you would still see it used as money because of its other intrinsic properties, namely like its scarcity, durability, divisibility. And if gold were ugly, then obviously we wouldn't wear it as jewelry. But there are plenty of other precious gems and precious metals that would fill that function. Same thing with any sort of physical application. You have other materials and compounds and metals that can actually get that job done. So you don't need gold to be pretty. We don't need gold to be anything other than just a good money. So quite literally, gold cannot afford to lose its main source of value, which is the hardness as a money. It relies mostly on that for its economic value, and that is what we must understand when comparing gold to Bitcoin. Yes, gold takes physical form and is shiny and pretty, but that is not the source of its value. In fact, one could make the argument that having any other function other than being a money is a hindrance to the currency. Putting gold into an industrial application means that it is no longer a medium of exchange and thus performs one less of its functions or its duties. Okay, so when trying to make the case for gold's superiority over Bitcoin, keep in mind that what we're comparing is both their performances as a money, not their look or physical qualities, but how they function as a currency. You do yourself a great disservice by doing this surface level comparison because you're not comparing the thing that you think you're comparing. Forget gold's appearance or its industrial use cases. We are comparing two forms of money and how each performs that task. Now, all that being said, I really don't actually mind gold. I wouldn't be bothered if we went back to a gold standard either because we probably would be better for it as an economy. But when comparing apples to apples, when comparing the monetary properties of each, Bitcoin wins by a landslide. It's not even close. Nevertheless, despite Bitcoin serving as a complete upgrade from gold, with all the benefits and none of the downsides, people still don't give it the time of day. Instead, they narrowly view Bitcoin as more of like a stock or a speculative asset rather than a currency. So number 9 is treating Bitcoin like a stock. Many of the obituaries in the beginning of this episode, they struggle with this hurdle. The problem with treating Bitcoin like a stock, treating it like a speculative asset, is that Bitcoin is fundamentally a money that is not a stock. And we treat stocks differently than money because they behave differently. Now, I understand that Bitcoin to many people looks exactly like a stock from the outside, but stocks come with a number of assumptions that just simply do not apply to Bitcoin. And it can lead to some miscalculations when you're assessing the health of Bitcoin, as evident by this article by CNBC very recently had the headline, "Bitcoin trading volume is at its lowest in more than 4 years." Okay, they point to the amount of Bitcoin that's being traded back and forth on exchange platforms as an indicator of how well it's doing. And again, Bitcoin is a money, it is not a stock. You cannot treat it like one. So an exodus of Bitcoin from these trading platforms, it means that people are A, either they're saving that money and putting it in their own pockets, or B, they are spending it. They're spending their Bitcoin. Now, if you treat Bitcoin like a traditional stock, you can be blinded to the fact that those of us who own Bitcoin and take it very seriously, we don't want to trade it for the US dollar, okay? We don't want to keep it on these exchanges. We would much rather trade it for goods and services in the real world or hold on to its value as it appreciates. We know that Bitcoin is the superior currency. The fact that we need to exchange it at all, the fact that we have to go and temporarily convert our Bitcoin into US dollars and then buy certain goods or pay our bills with it, that is a bug, not a feature. Also keep in mind that a stock for many people is a mechanism whereby you put money in and you get more money out later on down the road when you go to sell it. For Bitcoin, that would mean an end goal of selling it for more US dollars. And let me tell you something, if you understand Bitcoin, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Bitcoin is by far the better money, and it's evident by that house example that I described before. So why in the world would you want to sell your better currency for a worse one? That doesn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense to buy and sell US dollars using Argentinian pesos with the goal of ultimately acquiring more and more pesos. So why in the world would you do that with Bitcoin? Ultimately, if you are viewing Bitcoin as a stock, it means that you have your eye on the wrong ball. And I'll be honest, I think most people who had Bitcoin early on was definitely treating it like a stock, and I know that I was one of them. When I first got into it, and as soon as you make a decent profit, you sold it, okay? I did the exact same thing. We'd like to look back in time and say that we were all just idiots for selling whatever Bitcoin that we had when the price was so cheap. But the truth is, we didn't know exactly what we had, so don't make that same mistake. You are holding the better currency. Do not trade it. Do not treat it like a stock and trade it for US dollars. Number 10, Bitcoin is a scam, right? It's a Ponzi scheme wrapped inside of a pyramid scheme and whatever else. There was an expert on TV that I had saw, some economist, talking about how Bitcoin is more or less a gigantic scam and how it's the biggest bubble of all time, and he stays far away from it because the price is being manipulated, and then at some point the rug is going to get pulled out from all of us, and we are going to be left with the shitty value of Bitcoin. First of all, let me just address the idea really quickly that somehow Bitcoin is this grand conspiracy. For Bitcoin to be a scam like a pyramid scheme or some such thing, then somebody or some group would have to just be at the top manipulating things and poised to profit from everybody else. This is simply just not the case. And anybody who does just a little bit of research will know that it truly is decentralized and there is no administrators, okay? And think about this rationally, okay? Right now, there's about $500 billion in Bitcoin. If someone was going to pull the rug, they would have already done so. No, Bitcoin is not a scam. But that still doesn't deter people from thinking that Bitcoin's price, and by extent its value, can be manipulated. I don't necessarily argue with this notion that the Bitcoin price could be influenced to a certain extent. Of course, you have Bitcoin millionaires that can buy vast quantities of it and sell it to their buddies, driving the price up to lure suckers into buying at high prices, and then they could sell it all of a sudden and leave you and me with, quote, worthless Bitcoin. But you see, therein lies the problem. Bitcoin will never be worthless, no matter how few dollars I can trade for it. That's the point that many people just are not getting. Bitcoin's value is not tied up in the amount of US dollars that you can trade for it. It is far more valuable than that. So I saved this point for last because it seems to be the biggest and most widely held misconception about Bitcoin. The idea that Bitcoin only has value because people believe in it. So number 11, Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. I saved this one for last because there's a lot that needs to be unpacked here. So when you say Bitcoin doesn't have any intrinsic value, what exactly do you mean? Are you suggesting that Bitcoin doesn't have any value simply because you can't touch it or because you can't see it? To me, that doesn't make any sense. You can't touch or see Wi-Fi, but that's incredibly valuable. So you must mean that Bitcoin has no intrinsic economic value. Unfortunately, this doesn't make any sense either, because when it comes to the economy, nothing has intrinsic value. Now, this is not very well known, so I'll say it again. When it comes to the economy, nothing has intrinsic value. Economic value is purely subjective. Now, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, surely there are things that are necessary for human life, like food and water, and they have value, right? And of course, that would be true. They do have value. But the distinction here is that it doesn't have intrinsic economic value. If that were the case, then why would oxygen be free and the Mona Lisa is so expensive, right? So one is so necessary for human life and absolutely free, and the other is inconsequential, but it's worth millions, if not billions of dollars. Because when it comes to the cost of something, its price tag, when it comes to how much economic value we give to something, it depends entirely on supply and demand. You could sink 1,000 hours of your hard work and resources in developing some sort of trinket, and if no one wanted to buy it, it's worthless. No matter how much you think it has intrinsic value, it may to you, but to anyone else, it's 100% worthless. So if nothing has intrinsic economic value, then saying that Bitcoin doesn't have it doesn't make any sense. It's not helpful. And if I'm really being honest here, it's not even helpful to include Bitcoin in the bin of things that have price tags, that have an economic value. Since Bitcoin is money, it's just a measuring stick used to measure the economic value or price tag of everything else. It doesn't make sense to put a price tag on money, so why would you do it with Bitcoin? Well, actually, I know why we do it. It's hard to economically grasp what Bitcoin is, so it's expedient for us to measure Bitcoin using our current system, using the US dollar. And I think that this fact contributes a lot to why so many economists and experts, so-called, don't understand Bitcoin. It's a competitor of the US dollar, so describing Bitcoin in those terms is not useful. You first have to understand more broadly what is money before understanding Bitcoin. But I digress. Going back to this question of whether or not Bitcoin has intrinsic value, do you mean that it has no intrinsic value because only people believe in its value? Now, I think this is the big one. I think most people mean this when they say Bitcoin has no value. Elizabeth Warren suggested this in an interview that she gave, where she said something like, you are buying it because you think the value is going to go up, and you sell it because you think the value is going to go down. Did everybody just wake up one morning and believe money was valuable? This idea that if we all just delude hard enough, something will magically have value, it's absurd. We don't believe something has value if we find that it works and performs a function that we need it to. No matter how much you convince the world, no matter how many millions of people believe that bananas are currency, it won't actually make them a currency, because acting out that belief has real-world consequences. Bananas are either a good currency or not, and the people who believe such nonsense, they're just going to go broke. So it's not a question of believing that it has value. Money doesn't need your beliefs. It's the same thing with like transportation or communication, right? It could give a damn about our collective beliefs. The fact is that we need those things. We don't believe in having a good money. We need a good money. People tend to value the things that we need, and in a free society, we do need a sound money. The question is Bitcoin that good money? Is it that sound money? Now, if you want to come up with some long-winded and mystical definition of money just to justify why Bitcoin does not fall into that category, then go ahead. I'm sure every single person that contributed to those obituaries thought Bitcoin wasn't a good money, and they all argued that Bitcoin didn't have any real value. They all thought Bitcoin's value was headed somewhere towards zero. Well, guess what? It's currently worth about $27,000. And to be completely fair, they could be right. Only time will tell. But whether you like it or not, you can cry about it all day long. The simple fact is, people from all over the world are increasingly using Bitcoin as a money. It has a real-world necessary function that people want. It's not a matter of intrinsic value. It's a matter of necessity. It's an incorruptible storage, account, and transference of value that's available to everybody. And even though we're at the near bottom of the fourth bear market, 40% of its all-time high, I'm still as convinced as ever that Bitcoin will be the global currency, not because that I believe that it should, but because it serves a purpose. It provides a function. It supplies a demand that we all need. So think about those articles that I read at the beginning. Think about all the fundamental beliefs that they got wrong. Each of them likened Bitcoin to a scam with no real-world value. But Bitcoin has done the exact opposite of what they thought that it would do. More people are using it, more people are adopting it, and the price of Bitcoin has only gone up. It should be clear to you that the typical tropes and talking points that you hear surrounding Bitcoin are wildly wrong. Each of these journalists or experts fell into a trap of not understanding Bitcoin fully and believing it to be something that it is not. Take a lesson from all of them. Don't always believe what you hear on TV or what you read online. Go do your own research, come to your own conclusions, don't trust, verify. And I'll see you next time. Conventional Wisdom is a FreedomCast production. You can visit us at freedomcast.us, or if you'd like to support our work, you can go to freedomcast.locals.com. We'll see you there.